All right, cool. So here with my friend Mo Rafiq, and yeah, we were just talking a bit about this track that I made called the Dragon Bible. Made it during a very deep shadow work process a couple years ago, and the track is very radical. Let's just say it would probably offend many Christians because essentially the track takes the listener on a journey. I don't want to completely spoil that journey, I guess, for those who might want to listen to it, but I'll give a general overview, which is basically there's a dragon god. He's flying through the emptiness and he decides to go to hell to talk to Satan and put Satan to the test, he says. And he says, I'm going to go to hell and free all the souls. And he says, I believe all the souls in hell deserve a second chance. Maybe if they feel unconditional love, they'll remember that what we do to one, we do to all. So it's kind of like this dragon god is like deciding he's going to go try to free all the beings in hell because he believes everybody deserves a second chance. And then he goes to hell and he sees Satan and he suddenly remembers a past life where Satan was actually his son, David Knight, in a past life. And then he recounts the tale of this past life where David Knight, his son, goes from like innocent child to eventually being like, let's just say, a very twisted individual who ends up going to prison and dies in prison. And as he's recounting this tale, he starts to notice that Satan is being affected by this tale and by the father's love, because there's this, he's like crying while he's telling the story, and there's like this love of a father coming through as the dragon is recounting this past life. And then Satan starts crying and starts like purging and screaming, and eventually the song reaches kind of an apotheosis where there's this giant, Satan has this giant purge, and then all of hell kind of dissolves and alchemizes and transfigures into heaven. And then suddenly Jesus Christ is standing there, and it's implied that, or it's stated clearly that David Knight, who eventually became Satan, this is kind of the idea, is that this past life was like the beginning of when David Knight, the soul of David Knight, started to become Satan. The idea is that all along David Knight, or Satan, was Jesus Christ, actually, that Jesus Christ was everyone in disguise, and including even Satan. And yeah, maybe it probably makes more sense if a person listens to the song. It's kind of hard to recount it. But but yeah, I think the most radical part of the song is that Jesus Christ is implied to, or is stated to have been Satan, and it's stated that that was the ultimate sacrifice. It's like, which I think that would be the truly like biggest blasphemy for Christians, because they view like Christ dying on the cross as the ultimate sacrifice. But this kind of plays with the idea that like taking on the karma of like a demon or Satan and living that out would actually be much more painful, and like potentially like, millions of times more painful and difficult than dying once on a cross. So yeah, and the idea was that Christ made the ultimate sacrifice to become Satan, to like ultimately transmute and transfigure all of our darkest shadows at the end of time, and then everything kind of becomes heaven, and then everyone's in heaven, and Sauron and Frodo are like dancing a jig, and Harry Potter and Tom Riddle are hugging like old friends, and then at the very end, the track ends with God actually like wakes up even out of that dream of heaven and is like, then I woke up, I was pure empty space, pure God mind, peace and eternal grace. I felt myself as pure love, then I went back to sleep, something like that. So it's like God wakes up out of that, experiences himself as pure love, and then goes back to sleep, implying that all of that was basically like a dream of God. And then God goes back asleep to have another dream. So it's a very interesting song. I'm still trying to like make sense of it years after creating that track, like make sense of how I feel about it and how I want to integrate it into my life. But Yeah, Mo had just listened to that song, so we were talking about it, and we just decided to press record and jam on some topics related to this. So, yeah, what comes up for you around this, my friend?
Well, one of the first things that comes up to me is kind of the suggestion in ancient Gnostic texts of the serpent in the garden being Jesus,
Mm,
and that kind of conceptualization, the whole thing, the Yahweh walking in the garden, it was all kind of designed by the demiurge, and it's just stuff to do with the apple being sort of a true knowledge, and the entire story is kind of thrown on its head. And I don't necessarily subscribe to that understanding, or I'm not like willing to go to bat for it in a way, but like the point of the story of the Adam and Eve story is like that it has infinite depth.
mm,
Yeah, so it's like it's strange to be like there's only one correct interpretation of a story that deep. And I think your song like really touched on that. I think it really touched on something in a way archetypal, and something that we all sort of, I think, is in the edge of a lot of people's minds, but no one's really willing to go there. You know what I mean?
mm,
No one really wants to fully kind of embrace that, just because we have so many, I think we have so many like uh parameters in our mind that we don't want to cross, because it's just like, especially if you're raised religious at all, you're just like, I'm just not gonna bother with all that. I'm gonna do my thing, and do what I've been, or just focus on the understanding that I've been raised with. But also something that comes up to me is, just the whole concept of David Knight, you know, being Satan, and being kind of this unforgivable, inexcusable figure, and then it turning around into the love of Christ, also reminded me a lot of an ayahuasca experience I had that I think you might have written about, where like I I was the father sort of to the Antichrist, or I was with someone, and then they gave birth to the Antichrist, and it was this crazy Judgment Day scene of being at the end of time sort of, and the whole world being an audience, and she was going to bring out of her this absolutely wretched, absolutely disgusting, just completely like unlovable being, it felt like at the time, just like something you just absolutely would not want to ever engage with in any sense. And it was also my fault that this was happening, so it was like this like really really brutal thing. And then once it happened, and it's like, oh, I can't even look at this thing, whatever it is, and then realizing that the only option, and this is obviously much more dramatic in that space, but realizing that the only option was to love this creature, love this being, and that was the only option to anything. And that's when the whole, experience turned around, and it was all suddenly all about love, and and it just all transformed. So I think this is something that, a lot of people are maybe, simultaneously contending with in some sense, especially more like seeking type people. It might have something to do with Saturn and Pisces,
mm,
or something like that.
mm,
But yeah, it is interesting what's going on, and I think Saturn and Pisces might mean, Pisces is wholeness, Pisces is Jesus Christ, Pisces is the whole spiritual thing of ineffability and everything like that. So so it's kind of like I've been thinking, just like with so many interpretations, so many ways of seeing things, so many things, and also just like believing, as a lot of us do, that nothing's ever happened, that everything's already happened, that that like it's like, what do you hold on to? What do you base your life around? An infinite amount of interpretations of anything, just an infinite amount of facts about the world, an infinite amount of things you could focus on. What exactly do you do? I don't know. What does that bring up for you?
mm. Yeah, that's a good question. Um, and I feel like for me, the answer is love. Love is what, when the heart opens to love, that's what clarifies for me at least, like the clear pathway through this world with all of its many possibilities and interpretations. I just most fundamentally, I see love with a capital L as being the essence of God. I mean, you could say God is such a profound mystery that it can't be encapsulated just by saying love, but I feel like of any human word in English, I feel like the word love comes closest to God's essence. And so for me, trying to open my heart to God, become closer to God and let God guide me is really at this point my modus operandi, or how I navigate this realm. Voice is a little sore because we just had a retreat over the weekend and we did a lot of shouting and stuff like that. Just had a men's
Oh
retreat.
yeah,
Yeah, in
where was
Iowa.
it?
In Iowa.
Iowa.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we're doing another one next weekend out here in Iowa. So it was, yeah, it was really cool. But to one other thought that I wanted to touch on was it's interesting that if you went to like the non-dual Hindu traditions, like the Vedantic traditions, they would have a lot of those guys wouldn't bat an eyelash at the suggestion that Satan is Jesus Christ, right? Or that you know God is all and that there's nothing that is not God. And so, they'll even depict God in the form of Kali or other very destructive, you know, entities or forces and say, yeah, well, that's God too. And even in the Bible, it does, at one point, God says, I created the evil also.
Yeah,
But
in the
that's like
Quran.
the big no within most of Christianity is like there's a quite a strong dualism of like what is of Satan is not of God, and that is kind of like
Yeah,
it's not all God. God's essence is like beyond creation, and yeah, it depends on the theology within Christianity, but that's kind of an interesting difference there between like some of the radical non-dual Eastern traditions as compared to more Orthodox Christianity, is that there's really this insistence on a dualism within Christianity. But yeah, I don't know. I like I say, I'm still piecing it together. I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about this, but I do feel like there's a profound sense in which everything is the Christ, everything is God, and even and
no,
even
I definitely agree.
and even Satan is whatever Satan actually means, whatever that refers to, the countervailing force of darkness in the world is also made of the substance of divinity, and even and in its heart of hearts is also innocent, I would say. Like I feel like the heart of every being deep
Yeah,
down is innocent and untouched and unsullied and is of the same essence as God, but then at the more outer manifestation layers of any being, there can be plenty of forgetfulness and confusion and ignorance, and that to me is what leads to horrible crimes and violence and atrocities. Is just basically forgetfulness of what we really are.
yeah. No, I definitely agree foremost about it all being love, and love being obviously greater than that word love, what we refer to when we say love. But yeah, I mean, I think infinite love is all there is, and that's what we're talking about in the like kind of final sense when we're talking about God. Although I don't want to say that I have any like understanding of the mystery of it all, like that saying is, that's just words,
Mm,
of course.
mm, mm,
So, but
mm,
yeah, I think infinite love is all there is in all the forms in the world. Satan, you know, even Jesus, even, all of us, we all just return into that love, and it's just,
mm,
that's all there is. But knowing how to live with that, like even knowing that it's all love, like you can be like, drug cartels killing people. That's a, that's an instantiation of that love. You know
mm,
what I mean? So it's just like, it doesn't necessarily for me, like, I don't feel like I fully have, knowing that I fully have the, like, a good understanding of how to live. And I think that's where like these religions come in. But like what you were saying, about how everything is of that essence, and sort of like Orthodox traditions don't fully, they don't embrace that really. It's like it was very strict delineation between the good and the evil. I'm thinking about all these Orthodox people that I've seen who like, and even now Tucker Carlson, was saying that I think he's Episcopalian or something. But kind of this like automatic association of the kind of UFO, UAP phenomenon with demons. Have you seen this stuff?
Mhm. Haven't seen that. Haven't seen that yet. No.
Yeah, that's one of those famous Orthodox characters of the 20th century wrote a book about that, and that's almost seems to be the kind of the automatic um, position of a lot of Eastern Orthodox people and everything like that. And it's like it's very hard to know where to stand because you don't want to lose any sense of tradition or anything like that. Like I think maybe you and me have both realized the kind of grounding nature of tradition
Mhm.
and community and everything like that. But at the same time, you see the way that the most sort of traditional variants of a lot of traditions just really close themselves off to everything they don't understand, like everything to do with the mystery, and it becomes sort of like it's all just about avoiding sin. Of like, there's no wonder to it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious, like to give people a little more context. I'm currently really grappling with whether or not to identify as a Christian myself. Like I've kind of been I was raised Catholic and I'm like putting the past few months I've basically put that identity back on to kind of see how it feels because I had these very powerful experiences of Christ the last few years and feeling this deep connection to Christ. So I have been like returning to the church to see how that feels. Currently, I'm in a space of like pretty deep wrestling with Christianity and just trying to decide like, do I do I actually want to identify as a Christian and take on everything that comes with that versus just like being a lover of Christ and a lover of God and someone who can draw upon the wisdom and the values of the church that do resonate
Yeah.
with me and that do feel like a useful undergirding structure. And, I could still go to church sometimes, even if, non-Christians are also welcome to go to
Yeah.
church, right? So, yeah, so I'm in that type of space, and you're coming from a background of, I believe, having been
Um,
raised within Islam and being a Muslim currently, and so I'm curious how this conversation connects to Islam. Like, how do you see your more non-dual views in the context of Islam? Do you associate with
yeah.
the Sufi, like the mystical tradition of Islam, or how does all that,
Well,
yeah,
it's interesting. Well,
compute for you?
the Sufi thing definitely, when I first realized about it as a teenager, it opened up, a massive space for that sort of non-dual understanding, and that which is very grateful for, because without that, there'd be no way I could take in, what I like from other traditions, what I like from Hinduism, what I like from Christianity. I was a big Ram Dass guy as a teenager and still am. But yeah, so I do, have that kind of Sufi mystical kind of bent, that nature, and also a perennial sort of just automatic bent of, all religions are true, none are literal, and they're all kind of different ways, different instantiations of the same universal truth. But at the same time, I like consider myself a practicing Muslim. Like I pray 5 times a day, not always on time, but 5 times a day. I avoid alcohol. I I prescribe to other, restrictions. The language I use with the people closest to me in my life, my family, is a lot of time just, it's traditionally Muslim language. It's stuff that, if you were raised in this tradition, you would like, you'd be hearing 1,000 times a day something good happens. We say Alhamdulillah. something bad happens, we say astaghfirullah, God forgive us. So it's just like very traditional. And it's very strange because I'm not at all a traditional person. Like it seems like my nature is just like inherently just like strangely questioning and just like alien and rebellious. I think it's my Mars and Venus and Aquarius maybe. But um but yeah, so I think the most important thing to me is the Islamic practice of dua or supplication, which is prayer, which isn't necessarily the major Sufi thing. The Sufi thing is like losing yourself in God, and kind of through dance or through other sort of meditative means. And I think all that stuff is incredibly valuable, but in like the day-to-day trenches of life, like it's just prayer that is kind of the most important thing to me. And just like kind of just having it constantly proven to me that prayer like legitimately works. Is no like ifs, ands, or but there's no like complicated kind of psychological element to it. It's like you ask for what you want and then you get it. Like it's kind of crazy the way it is, the way the world is oriented like that. You can just ask for it. And I'm constantly telling people like this, and I'm annoying like with my friends who are like less religious or whatever. Because my only advice at the end of the day, they'll come to me with their problems, girl problems, work problems, and I'm just like, have you tried praying about it? And no one wants to hear that ever. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like I don't know what to say, dude. Like, like
Mm.
you'll get through this.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
what do you
interesting
mean?
that people have like I can't imagine not being able to pray. Like it's
Yeah.
strange to think that people don't have that connection through prayer. It, interestingly though, like yeah, I typically I don't usually ask for things through prayer that could be like proven to me, I get. Like it would be hard to quantify if it actually like happened or not, because I typically find myself more so just praying for like God to clean my heart and open my
Yes.
heart and give me what I cannot buy with gold, give me a clean heart
Yeah.
and or like humble me, help me stay humble, help me stay grounded. And it does seem to like I've been saying those types of prayers a lot for a couple years, and I do feel much more like grounded and humble and in my heart overall generally then. But yeah, so I'm curious how you like what types of prayers have you seen answered, if you feel like sharing, if you're open to sharing that.
Well, that's the nature of a lot of my prayer. Like you said, like, please guide me, show me how to do better, show me how to serve you better. Please increase me in gratefulness. Please increase me in faith, So
Mm.
and I think that is most central. That is why we're here. And that is the purpose. But no, I'm seriously like everything, anything you ask for, I think you can get. I think it's like we have this verse in the Quran about Solomon in in Judeo Christianity, who for us is a prophet, and he asks God, "Give me a kingdom like the world has never seen before." And God gives him a kingdom like the world's never seen before. So it's like there's this interesting tension where it's like we're not supposed to care about the world and everything like that, but even in the Old Testament, Abraham and many of his descendants, they receive, they're God's chosen. They receive worldly success. Like so, it's this very interesting tension that is through line through religion, and it's kind of this idea of he who aims for heaven will have both the world and heaven, and he who aims for the world will have neither,
Mm.
or something like that. But yeah, I've had prayers. What something that comes to mind is uh before my first ayahuasca experience that we were talking about. I just kept making prayers. I was so scared, so nervous. I was very, very afraid of the darkness of my own mind. Um, and so I just kept making prayers like, God, please be gentle and merciful with me. Please be gentle and merciful with me. Like, please, make it easy. And then I got there, and there was this profound moment on the trip where, like, there was another woman who was screaming and flailing. They had to take her outside. She was like, "What the fuck is going on?" And I was like, "Oh my God, is that about to be me?" And then But then there was this moment where like I broke through and I had that experience of all is love, and I made it through, and I just suddenly realized like, oh my God, God literally was gentle and merciful with me, and just
Mhm.
having that realization and that same experience, I realized my parents didn't know where I was. So for 10 hours in Mexico, they were like unable to contact me. And it was my birthday. So they were like trying to contact me to wish me happy birthday. And I remember realizing that during the trip and just like not being able to let go and like enjoy myself because I'm like, oh my God, they're freaking out. They're gonna call the cops or something. And then I just in that moment I was praying, please let them know I'm okay. Please let them know I'm okay. You know what I mean? Let them know that it's all okay. And then, I called them the next morning and they were slightly freaked out, but like knowing them, knowing the level of freaked out they could have been, like it was very unordinary how unfreaked out they were. So it's just
Mhm.
like stuff like that. Like you can, if you truly pray with the fullness of your heart, and we're constantly having it proven in my family, like financial duress, um, praying about that has worked very clearly. If I have an assignment due for work or for school, and I fucked off for a week, like you'll catch me like at like 10 p.m. the night before it's due praying, and somehow it gets in, it all gets in, and it's all good.
Mhm.
Like, and I should not fuck off for a week, but like
Mhm.
point is that it's just like it's amazing, and that was something I realized on ayahuasca too. Like I felt it. I felt that whatever you ask for, I will give you. But in that moment, you don't want to ask for anything because you're in awe of God who's in front of you, and all you want is that. So it's like because it's infinitely better than anything and everything in this world. So that was the interesting contradiction where when you're in that experience, you're like, I don't want to ask for anything. Like you're right here. Like you're so much better than anything. But also, like you mentioned about the Sufi thing, and an important aspect of it is like, I believe God is both impersonal and personal. And the Sufi focus might tend to be a little bit more on the impersonal, the mystical oneness. But for me, the biggest help is knowing God knows me personally, like knows my individual struggles, knows my individual neuroses, the things that I'm obsessed with and that trouble me. You know what I mean? So, there's just a space in Islam for all of that. This idea that God is closer to you than your own jugular vein. That's what it says in the Quran, knowing of all things. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Mm,
I
beautiful.
don't know if that was an answer.
Yeah, no, beautiful, beautiful
Yeah,
reflections. Yeah, I also find the personal relationship with God really. I love both. I love like just melting into the impersonal, formless light
yeah,
and just like being with the light, resting as light, and
yeah,
being just kind of beyond this world. And I love feeling that God can also emanate forth as a person, as the person of Jesus Christ, or as, these different personages of the Father, of Mary. I connect a lot to Jesus, but I find that extremely comforting as well. So yeah, I have a lot of respect for the different paths to God, like whether it be
yeah,
more like devotional in relation to a personage, or if it be more, yeah, more mystical, more transcendent, more impersonal.
yeah,
Couple other threads I wanted to pull on. Well, there's two here. For one, I did want to mention at some point in this conversation what you shared about how Jesus is also considered the Messiah within Islam, which I was not aware of that. So that's a very
yeah,
interesting piece. And then if we have time to jump back to it, I also am curious to tease out the difference between prayer and manifestation a little bit, because I,
yeah,
I liked what you said about praying with the fullness of your heart. I
yeah,
think there's something there around like a lot of manifestation coming more from like up here and more from like ego. People are trying to like control
yeah,
reality from their ego and manifest their dreams, and I think that often doesn't work and can have like karmic consequences. So
yeah,
something there around like praying from the fullness of your heart when there's really a need. Like it has to kind of, I don't know, it has to come from a pure place
yeah,
somehow. Like if it comes from just an egoic like craving, then it doesn't I don't think it works the same way. So anyway, those are two threads that are alive for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So for the first thing, yeah, this is not super well known about outside of Islamic circles because I don't think Muslims always broadcast it so much because I think there's this competitive relationship between, the major relationships, religions of the world, especially Islam and Christianity. Judaism isn't so much an evangelizing religion. So there'll often be this kind of, people won't talk about this much, but Jesus is definitely a central figure in Islam. Um, and that it's just established, everyone will know that Jesus is a prophet and a messenger in Islam and brought down the Injil, the gospel, you know. But then there's this other kind of mysterious phrase in the Quran, like referring to Jesus as the Messiah, which is a big deal, of course. And then Jesus is referred to as the Word of God, which that to me is the most interesting one, even though the Quran explicitly refutes that Jesus is the Son of God. It's because in Islam there's this concept of oneness where God is the creator and cannot like be considered at all to having begot or be begotten, you know what I mean? There's this level of just like absolute glorification, exaltation above creation. Whereas in Christianity, it's almost like God is more immanent within creation. God is immanent in Islam too, but it's different. But it's very hard to talk about this stuff. But yeah, the word of God is interesting to me because I feel like no one really knows what that means in a way. We have ideas. You can listen to Jordan Peterson talk about it for like 2 hours, and you might get a little like closer to it or something. But like it's just a very mysterious phrase, and I don't think you can fully rationally think about it. But it's almost like this is God's message to the world. This spirit of mercy and self-sacrifice that Jesus embodied is um is the word of God. That is how God embraces his creation. You know what I mean? Um and then there's also just Mary is mentioned more in the Quran than any other person, and it's also we have the nativity story, although we don't have the inn thing, the story of the inn is full and everything like that. Mary is a
I don't know. I don't know that story.
Oh, you don't know isn't the Christian nativity story like that Christmas is often kind of the nativity scene involves like Joseph and Mary going to an inn and the inn being
Oh,
full.
the inn is full. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Now that's I thought you said the end is full.
No,
The
no,
inn is
the inn.
full. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
gotcha. Yeah, yeah. Then they go to the manger. Yeah.
But in Islam, Mary is alone when she gives birth to Jesus. And and it's interesting, like if you go back to very early Christian texts that have since been found, there is an exact church in the desert over there that says this is where it happened. This is where and it kind of matches up the Quranic telling, and it matches up old scrolls of um found in early Christian texts that didn't make it into the final canon. So it's interesting. But the reason I bring that up is to say the way that Muslims relate to the Quran isn't quite the same as the way that Christians relate to the Bible, where I heard Alex O'Connor, who's actually this atheist YouTuber, say this, where it's more like the Quran is to Islam what Jesus is to Christianity. You know what I
Mm.
mean? It's not the Quran to the Bible, because the Bible, even very many Christians will say that, yeah, it's not fully historically accurate. It's not like every word of the Bible is true, in a sense. It is true in a historical kind of empirical sense. But Jesus, if Jesus is in front of you, you're not going to contradict anything that Jesus says. You know what I mean? He is the final word. Everything that he says is it's it. And that's kind of Muslims' relationship to the Quran. And there's this kind of like to demonstrate it, like Muslims believe every word of the Quran is directly from God. And there's like a power to that. There's a clarity to that where you don't have to debate certain things at all. Like
Mm.
it's just like, and obviously God's truth is above language and greater than language. But in terms of language, it's just such a useful document to have in a way. And it and the things that it says in there, like you just believe it. Like there's no murkiness. There's like a lot of murkiness around Jesus as a historical figure. There's just so much mystery there, which is I love personally, where I love that like we don't know what Jesus' deal was. Was he in India, dude? Like was he in Japan? Like where was he? What was he up to? I think that's so cool. But at the same time, like the clarity where when the Quran says that Jesus spoke that Muhammad was to come and to give a message, sort of in his lineage, it says that in the Quran. Like, there's no doubt in my heart that that's like actually factually true. And that's because in the Quran, there's the story. Let me tell you two stories about the Quran if there's time, and that'll explain. Oh, thank you.
Mm.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe if you're at some point in the storytelling, I'd be really curious to know how you grapple with some of the more difficult verses in the Quran that some people find like,
Yeah. Yeah, I will definitely want to go into that. But yeah, so it was just two things. It was one thing, there's the story of the prophet coming up to these local Jewish tribes and he and they question him. They question him about these three stories that they have, these three ancient stories. And like, if you can tell us, if you can answer these questions, then what you're saying is true. And one story is the story of the cave of the seven sleepers, and this is this old story about seven people leaving their town, being persecuted, going to sleep in a cave, and then waking up 500 years later. And so the prophet's able to say this story. And then there's another story about what was it? There's another story about Moses wandering around with this kind of mysterious figure called Kidder, who's often associated with weed, actually, like marijuana. But the point is that the prophet wasn't actually able to give the Jews at that time, this Jewish tribe, an answer. It was only after like 3 weeks. He said, "I'm going to give you an answer tomorrow," and it never came, the answer. And so after 3 weeks, the answer came, and God said, whenever you say God is going to do something, say God willing. And that was a reprimand. So the Quran is full of mistakes that the prophet makes, and then he's reprimanded and told the right way, and then given a correct answer. So that kind of like increases your faith in the text as being like legitimately like divinely revealed in a way. Like if someone was just to come up with something, they would just be like, I have the full truth. It's all coming from me. I'm not going to make any mistakes or anything like that. And then there's this this other surah called Surah Romans. And the Arabs at the time were very curious about what was the Romans and the Byzantines were fighting nearby. And the Arabs at the time, oh, the Persians, I mean, were fighting nearby. And the Arabs were curious who was going to win, just as neighbors, as onlookers. And the Persians had a victory, and the polytheists of Mecca sort of heralded that as a victory for polytheism. Then the revelation comes down. The Persians have won a victory over the Romans in a nearby land. In a few years, that victory will be reversed, and all victory belongs to God. And then you go back historically, that actually happened. Like there was a reversal in a couple of years after that.
Mm.
So I say all that just to like say the kind of text that the Quran is like, and you don't have to buy in, of course. Only like as a Muslim you would buy in. But I'm trying to explain the relationship that Muslims have to the text, where it's just like finally clarity in a way that you don't get always, just like living your life, like even seeking or anything like that. And so that's kind of my relationship to Islam in a way, where it's just like, okay, this is something I can like rest in. But yeah, go ahead. You were gonna ask about sort of problematic versus.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. That's useful to know. And a lot of Christians do have a very similar relationship with the Bible, I think. I don't personally. I'm doubtful. I have a very hard time believing that the Bible doesn't have any man-made distortions that have crept into it through all of its endless
Mhm.
revision and translation and being passed on word of mouth for many centuries before the invention of the
Yeah,
printing press and stuff like this.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, with respect to the Quran, um, I am curious how you grapple with some of the more controversial verses. Like I think I am not that familiar with the Quran, but I've seen some verses that are quite, jarring about like non-believers and how non-believers are to be dealt with, or something about like, I don't know,
Yeah.
go to war with the non-believers, things like this.
Yeah. I think that the Quran, it needs to be read in its historical context in a way where a lot of those so there'll be a verse and a Ben Shapiro type will bring it up where it says like kill the Jews in the Quran or something like that. Um, but what he'll kind of neglect to note is that it's like talking about like battling and going to war with a specific Jewish tribe nearby to the prophet's people at that time who were sort of conspiring with the prophet's enemies. So at this time in Arabia, you know, you're kind of constantly existentially at risk of complete extermination and demise because that was, it was a warring um nation. So a lot of it is stuff like that. And it's like most of it is in self-defense and retaliation, a lot of those wars, and they're kind of just wars. And the prophet, it's not like there's an important notion in Islam that there's no compulsion in religion. There was never any kind of idea that anyone should be forced to convert to this new religion or anything like that. And it doesn't even tell Jews and Christians to convert. It tells them that this is the truth from the Lord and just not to deny that. It questions like the Jewish people who were questioning at that time. It says, did you think that you were worthy of a revelation, but a revelation couldn't be sent down to the Arabs or something like that? So it's kind of playing around with it in a way. But it's more like a lot of it was there was that sort of existential, just like they needed to strategically stay alive. But before that, they were being very persecuted by the pagans in Medina when the prophet came out with this, and there was constant. It was kind of like the apostolic age in Christianity, where martyrs were being made, and the Christians were persecuted for hundreds and hundreds of years until Rome itself just became Christian. You know what I mean?
Mm,
So it was kind of that was very compressed in Islam in a way, where the early followers of the Prophet were the poor people and the women and the orphans of Mecca, and they were being similarly persecuted by the pagans and the polytheists who had all the power, the slave owners in Mecca. And then at a certain time, they actually left. They left Mecca for Medina. They were driven out, basically. They just couldn't live with these people anymore who were persecuting them, who accused the Prophet of being a madman, of being uh, insane, of being power hungry, of being a sorcerer, like all this stuff. Kind of similar accusations that were levied at Jesus. And so the prophet had to eventually take his tribe and move to Medina. And then so a lot of those verses are God saying, go back to Mecca and take it back. They persecuted you. It's now time to remove the idols from the Kaaba and conquer your land back. So it's kind of like God doesn't make any mistakes, and we believe that as Muslims. So it's very easy for us to be like, no, that's okay. Those wars were all justified. And in historical context, when you dive deeper into it, you'll find that they are justified. And it's not just that, like, there'll be misunderstandings about the Quran. Like, people and Muslims stone rape victims in parts of the world. There's nowhere in the Quran that says you should do that. There's also this very kind of extensive hadith literature. And this is controversial. This is where I kind of step outside of the mainstream, the orthodoxy, where the reason we still rely on the Quran and think it's historically accurate as opposed to the Bible is that the Quran was memorized right away, like memorized word for word right away, So that kind of held against it, kind of corruptions that could seep into the text. Although I still think we run into problems with interpretation, changing interpretations over time and changing translations. That's kind of similar to the Bible and the Torah. But what was I saying?
Um, yeah, it was very interesting reflections. You were just reflecting for a while about the controversial stuff in the Quran and how you see it as being needed to be placed in a historical context, and that if you look at that historical context, you feel like a lot of these wars were justified. And
Yeah,
yeah, I that's a whole other topic. I do have to let you go in a few minutes here, but I think it's an interesting question of like when is war justified? How can we move beyond war as a species? But that's a big question. I would personally like to see us move beyond war as a species, but it seems like at a certain point that would require like people to just drop the need for vengeance, even if it feels like it's justified to seek
yeah.
vengeance or try to reclaim certain lost land or something. To move beyond war at a certain point, we'd have to drop that vengeful
I
impulse.
agree. I think in the case of the Prophet and his war to reclaim Mecca, it's kind of like Islam in its current form wouldn't exist if it wasn't for that. Like, and there would be way less religion in the world in a way, maybe way more paganism, polytheism. So I think it's very complicated, and I don't think paganism gets good results. I think we're kind of falling back into paganism as a culture in a way. But no, I hear you. And it was another option for them at that time. They could have laid down their weapons and they could have just, walked into a mass suicide. That's always an option. That's always an option. Just like that's what Gandhi recommended to the Jews. He said, I think it would have been way more powerful if they just simply embraced death and walked into it in the Holocaust. And it's like, yeah, like I hear what you're saying, but
I
like,
don't like that statement of Gandhi's
yeah,
either. I think that's
yeah,
ridiculous. And for me, I'd draw the line at like self-defense. Like if somebody was
yeah.
threatening my family and they're immediately present with weapons, I'm gonna try to, disarm or harm that person so that they don't hurt my family. So I think immediate self-defense is one thing, but then in cases of like, oh well, so and so did this 100 years ago, and we need
Yeah.
to finally pay,
Yeah.
pay back that debt or something. I think that's just like
No, of course.
that just leads
Revenge.
to the forever
Yeah.
war. It's just
Revenge is completely pointless. But yeah, I will agree that, that is something that it is an interesting tension in Islam that Christianity doesn't have to contend with at all because Jesus never took up a sword, or at least he won't until he comes back. You
mm,
know what I mean?
hmm.
But yeah, so there is kind of this element of Islam where Islam is almost it's more in the world in a way, uh, because because of this kind of like these political realities, whereas Jesus was willing to just like, and I'm not saying that the prophet wasn't willing to do this, but he wasn't asked to do this, but Jesus was willing to just lay down his life. There was no, I'm going to fight the people who persecute me. he's like, I'm going to walk into death and become a martyr, you know? And I have no doubt that um that the prophet would have done that too if he was asked to, but they're different stories, and it's interesting. I like that we have more than one story that we can pull from, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
Yeah.
One final thing, I was curious, what do you think the word Messiah means in the context of Jesus being the Messiah within Islam? Like the
Well,
eventual savior of humanity, or
yeah,
is
well, we believe in the second coming.
hmm,
So, it's not fully that's more extrapolated in the extra chronic Islamic literature. It's not explicitly in the text,
hmm,
but we're told from a young age that Isa, which is who we call Jesus, is coming back and is going to lead an army against Dajjal, which is sort of our conception of the Antichrist. It's very basic stuff in a way. Oh, and that actually reminded me what I was going to say. Yeah, so like with the Quran, it doesn't say anything about like stoning rape victims, or a lot of these things come from the Hadith, which are sort of texts which are reported sayings of the Prophet, and which I think, having not been memorized right away, and Muslims, kind of our scholars, will deny this because they have a ranking system of it, but I just think are way less reliable than people think. And I'm sort of, in a way, I'm very Quran focused, and a lot of people will take stuff from outside of the Quran. But yeah, regarding Jesus, he is coming back in the second coming. We have 50 signs of the day of judgment, many of which have been completed. One of which is that time will speed up, which I don't know how you feel in your day to day, but certainly to me, it feels like there's this thing of time having sped up.
hmm,
Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I personally think, like, I don't know if we're near the end, and in the Quran it says that you can never know whether you're near the end. Like, that knowledge alone rests with God. But we live in very interesting times, and in regards to Jesus as the Messiah, I believe the original kind of Jewish understanding of that was that Jesus, the Messiah, was a political title, right? Like King of the Jews, and they thought he was going to do
hmm,
come and do all this political stuff. But I personally think it's more like the Christian conception of being a savior, a spiritual savior.
hmm.
Yeah,
Interesting. Cool. Yeah, the war language is interesting to me again. Like Jesus will come back and lead a war against, or that's what I don't know if you said the word war, or like some kind of an armed rebellion against
the Antichrist.
yeah, the forces of the Antichrist. Like I do find that it just seems like if a people have that belief that that's eventually going to happen, it would be pretty easy to like have
Manipulate.
yeah, manipulate and have
Yeah.
misinterpretations of like, oh, well, it is the end times now, and we need to,
Yes.
launch this war against the Antichrist, and then but then it's like, okay, but how do you? It's subjective to
Yeah.
define what is exactly the Antichrist, and
Yeah.
we run into issues when Democrats think Republicans are the Antichrist and Republicans think Democrats are the Antichrist, and it's like
Yeah.
you can get the
Although
same
Donald
thing,
Trump,
you know.
Donald Trump does make a strong candidate for the Antichrist. I've gone down some schizo threads on YouTube. I'm
Mm,
not even, I don't have a strong animus against Trump or anything like that.
mm,
The vaccine shit was shady, but I never felt one way or the other. But people have done very extensive kind of point by point things on the Antichrist in Revelation
mm,
and the son of perdition, and it's very interesting actually to look into that stuff. But yes, I agree. And a lot of this stuff is extra chronic, and it's just like sort of people passing it down in traditions and talking. And I don't know the extent to which, like, the the travails of the end times and eschatology is stuff that's going to be external in the world war, or if it should be considered internal, psychological, spiritual, or the way these things connect. Um, it's very interesting. But there is, like, we have texts like the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna, where Arjuna says, I'm not going to fight against my family, for honor or anything like that. And then Krishna spends, the entire text telling him, actually, you should fight against them, and here's why, So there's interesting stuff like that to consider. But yeah, honestly, it's still a process. I'm still figuring it out too. I have no idea, the extent to which I've noticed when I try and change people, no one has ever once changed. The only thing that brings benefit is when I pray for people, pray for people who are troubling me, who are making things hard for me, who are my enemies, So I don't know how much of anything should be externalized, but I think in the years to come, a lot of these questions are going to come to the forefront of everyone's minds.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, it's probably just gonna keep getting stranger and
Yeah,
yeah. I
I
mean,
agree.
yeah, it's very interesting question. Like, are we near the end times, and is the end just another beginning, a beginning of something else? And does anything ever truly end, and this type of stuff? And
It's
uh,
got to be a
yeah.
cycle, right? Like, but even that's a human conception. Like,
Yeah.
so
I mean, I would
yeah,
say my deepest experiences of God would suggest to me that nothing ever truly ends.
yeah,
So that's at least where I stand on that. It's like there is no finish line, even if even if all things are redeemed in the light of God and brought back to God, and then all things are in that space of infinity with God. Well, that just
yeah.
isn't that is eternity, and that has no beginning or end. And then who knows? Maybe if we're all in that type of heavenly eternal space for long enough, we'll decide, well, maybe
I want to do the story.
let's play
Yeah,
another round of that game. That was kind of fun,
yeah.
that dance. I don't always like to call it a game, but it's hard to describe whatever this is. Let's
It's very hard to.
do another dance of creation and see what what
Yeah.
comes of that. That was interesting, and we learned a lot from that exploration. So yeah.
No, I totally agree. I think that's the right way of looking at it. If there's any right way of looking at it, that's the closest we could get maybe for
Mm,
now, So, but yeah, I think this song has been going on for a very long time and will keep going on for a very, very long time.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's crazy to think of, like, there's probably trillions and trillions of other planets out there with entirely different stories and religions going on simultaneously, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
I just think the divine plan is much vaster than we can ever, yeah, for me, than our minds can ever contain, or any book could contain. It's so it's
So big.
so
No,
vast, and
it's
can't
true.
can't be fully compressed into words. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
mystery, living
I,
mystery.
I totally agree. And there's the other dimensions too. That's why for me, the hardest thing is just figuring out what to hold on to, what to focus on. Is just with infinity on every side, going out and out. It's just like, what do I in this individual human life focus on, you
Mm.
know? And yeah, but that's the game.
Yeah. A
It's figuring
couple final heuristics for anybody listening that I like on that is, like,
it
to one, we become what we focus on, and number two, focus on what you want to see more of. So if you believe that you become what you focus on, then it's like, well, I should focus on what I would like to be
out.
becoming, what I like to be, focus more on love, and like, and the more beautiful world our hearts know as possible, and then I become kind of, a shepherd of that, an emissary of that. That's kind of how I make sense of the question of what to focus on. It's like, okay, well, I want earth to move in the direction of that north star of Christ's love,
Yeah,
so I'm going to try to share that in my, flawed human way.
yeah.
But yeah,
You
everybody
also
has to answer that for themselves, for sure. So
you also have a family, so kind of a little bit is built in to the
yeah.
game, So that's helpful, I think, having that level of groundedness where it's like, well, I have to provide for my family, you know?
Mm, that's true. It does provide a lot of structure and clarity and direction to have a family. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm very, yeah, blessed to have a family and love my wife and daughter very much. And yeah, it's been amazing to talk to you, my friend. Thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
You as well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, yeah, you're welcome. You're
Run it
welcome.
back.
Yeah, I'll stop it here.